With the war in Ukraine still ongoing, and now border skirmishes between Armenia and Azerbaijan, potential conflict between Serbia and Kosovo, and escalating tensions between China and Taiwan, it's not difficult to imagine a scenario like World War II occurring today. World War II started slow, with a few small wars taking place, before later escalating into a full world war. Now, I'm not saying that will happen, in fact I think it's highly unlikely, but it made me wonder just how much could the US build up its military to fight a modern day World War II scale war. Tanks and aircraft are infinitely more complicated today, and they cannot be built anywhere near as fast or in the numbers that we saw during World War II. And now we see Russia and even some Western countries begin to run low on equipment and weaponry just from the war in Ukraine alone, and it's only been 6 months. So how might a conventional World War III go today? How strong a force can the US quickly assemble to fight? But first, real quick, I want to say thanks to this video's sponsor for making it possible, YouGov. We could probably all use a little bit of extra cash these days, and they make it quick and easy to do so, just by sharing your opinion. They have surveys and polls on a bunch of different topics, like politics, products, brands, pop culture, and more. So instead of wasting a few hours scrolling through social media, in that same time you can get your opinion heard and earn gift cards or even cold hard cash in the process. I've had an account for years, and right now I wouldn't mind a boost trying to replace my recently crashed hard drive. So go over and give it a try. Click the link down in the description box to start making money. Again, thanks to YouGov for sponsoring this video. To get an estimate of how strong of a force the US can build, I decided to focus on the BCT, or Brigade Combat Team. So, a few basics first. You might have 3,000 tanks, but you can't simply send them all out into the battlefield. They just get destroyed. Tanks need to be supported and backed up with infantry to protect against things like anti-tank missiles, infantry fighting vehicles to defeat the enemy infantry, artillery to suppress the enemy, along with all the logistics and additional support equipment needed such as medical, maintenance, intelligence, and so on. Therefore, a mix of these are grouped together to form a coherent formation, with everything they need to operate and fight pretty much on their own. And these formations are what you can set into combat with specific tasks to achieve an objective. The size of these formations vary from country to country. Russia, for example, uses beefed up battalion-sized formations called BTGs, or Battalion Tactical Groups. The US uses larger formations at the brigade level called BCTs, or Brigade Combat Teams. Honestly, there are pros and cons to each. If you got a Russian and American tactician in a room, they could argue endlessly about which is better. BCTs are relatively new. Previously, the US Army was mostly centered around much larger mechanized divisions of 10 to 20,000 personnel. In the mid-2000s, it then shifted to a smaller but more modular structure, eventually arriving at the BCT. And they could be changed or replaced with something new in the future. The US Army structure is always changing as it tries to figure out what is most effective, as well as adapting to new weaponry and technologies, and changes in a potential enemy, especially since the end of the Cold War. Now, you might have noticed I'm using some of these icons. This might be a little bit more detailed than you're interested in learning, but there's really only a few icons you need to know to get a decent understanding. First, this X. It means infantry. It's believed to have come from the crossed belts that infantry would use back when military iconography and symbology were being created. So that's pretty easy to remember. The next is this oval or capsule shape. It means armor, typically a tank. Then you can combine the two, a capsule with an X. So that means some sort of armored vehicle that carries infantry. This would be things like infantry fighting vehicles or armored personnel carriers, etc. And it means mechanized infantry. Then finally, two main affiliations. A rectangle means it's your own or friendly forces, and then a diamond means it's hostile or enemy forces. With just these, you'll be able to quickly understand the majority of detailed, complex maps such as Jomini of the West produces. There are literally hundreds more, but those make up the majority of combat units you'll see. But those three I mentioned, infantry, mechanized infantry, and armor, are the three types of brigade combat teams, again BCTs, that the US Army has. IBCT for infantry, SBCT based around the Striker fighting vehicle, and a ABCT, armed with tanks as well as Bradleys. Right now, the US Army consists of 32 brigade combat teams in the regular army, and 28 more in the National Guard, for a total of 60. 17 of those are armored, 9 Striker, and 34 infantry BCTs. So how many BCTs could the US form in the event a major war broke out? The US Army has well over 100 different types of vehicles, so trying to tabulate each variant, how many of each are in each and every unit in each BCT, and counting how many the Army has in total would take weeks. So, for simplicity's sake, I've narrowed it down to two different types of trucks or utility vehicles, a Humvee variant and a larger truck for cargo, water, fuel, etc. And then the 6 main combat vehicles, the Striker family, Abrams tank, Bradley fighting vehicle family, the M109 self-propelled artillery, and the M119 and M777 towed artillery. And just a quick note, because I know someone might call me out on it, the US Army is producing the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle, or JLTV, to replace the Humvees, but so far they've only acquired a little over 2,000 of them. Compare that to the 140,000 Humvees in service. So it's going to be a while before they catch up. As for vehicles, the average infantry BCT requires around 100 Humvees for cavalry squadron and infantry battalions, 18 M119s for artillery, then 521 Humvee variants, and 778 various trucks for support and logistics. A Striker BCT is 219 Strikers, 18 M777s, 556 Humvees, and 992 trucks. And finally, an armored BCT with 84 Abrams, 105 Bradleys, 18 M109s, 516 Humvees, and 806 trucks. For the most part, both the regular and National Guard BCTs have the same structure, and that is 3 base battalions of whatever type BCT it is, then a cavalry squadron, which is recon, a fires battalion, which is artillery, and then an engineer battalion and a support battalion. There are some BCTs that do vary, and they may have more or less, but either way, that's a lot of vehicles, especially those support vehicles. In fact, the number comes out to be roughly 13 support or logistical vehicles for every 1 combat vehicle. It really is incredible just how many are needed just to keep the war going. Also, you might have noticed that I left out a few notable pieces of weaponry, for example, air defense, and now the infamous rocket artillery systems like HIMARS and MLRS. That's because these are not natively part of BCTs. They are typically in separate formations, and then they're attached or assigned to different BCTs as needed. But again, to make it a little easier, since the US has about twice the number of armored BCTs as Striker, and then twice the number of infantry as armored, I took an average of what each new BCT would require, then figured out how many of each vehicle the US has, subtract them by how many are currently being used in BCTs, and then get a number of how many BCTs could be created. That number is 21. Then we can go back to that ratio again and figure out the number of each that could be formed. 12 infantry, 3 Striker, and 6 armor brigade combat teams. That's only an increase of 35% over the current number. The biggest limiting factor is artillery, specifically the M119 used by infantry. If they wanted to cut back on the number of infantry BCTs though, or substitute weapons, or even cut the number of artillery batteries in each, the total number of BCTs that could be formed is 45. The next limiting factor is the number of Abrams tanks. The US has over 3,000 in storage, including 450 just recently withdrawn from the US Marines. So assuming that those are less demanding to be made combat ready, that could enable another 18 BCTs. So in short, the US likely has enough equipment to roughly double the number of BCTs from the current 60 to 123. There are a lot of caveats to that though. First is it's worth noting that this is ignoring some vehicles are likely being used in other formations. Also, it doesn't take into account smaller weapons and gear like rifles, night vision, radio sets, chemical protection, body armor, uniforms, trained personnel, and much more. The roughly 4,500 personnel per BCT means it would all require another 283,500 soldiers. Currently, the entire US Army Reserve consists of only 190,000, and those would also still require some time to further train. Another issue is trying to sustain a BCT in combat. Losing personnel, equipment, using up ammunition, fuel, and all the other supplies over time means a BCT is going to begin to lose combat effectiveness. These all have to be replaced. But if you're using every last reserve and have no replacements, then you're going to run into trouble pretty quickly. Typically, you'd want to keep somewhere around 25 to 50% of combat vehicles, depending on their type, held in reserves as replacements. For example, during the Gulf War, the US had some 3,000 Abrams in the Persian Gulf. 2,000 of those were assigned to deployable units, with the other 1,000 in reserve. The idea is, that should hopefully give you enough time to either pull and repair vehicles from storage, or produce new ones to keep up those formations' combat effectiveness. But realistically, that's unlikely. Modern wars against peer or even near-peer enemies have resulted in about 1% of tanks being lost every day. And a lot of people like to joke about the number of tanks Russia is losing in Ukraine, and then conclude that the tanks or crew are no good, but they've lost roughly 6 a day on average, which comes out to be 0.25% a day. That's 4 times less than Israel during the Yom Kippur War. I think it's also somewhat fair to say Ukraine is at least a near peer to Russia, at least in terms of anti-tank capabilities after they've received so many ATGMs and other weapons from the West. So even at that lower level, the US fighting a major war against, say, China for example, the US would be losing more tanks in 1 month than they have produced or overhauled in the last 2 years alone. Work can be increased, but only so much. The complexity of modern military hardware and all the computer systems means that production cannot just be ramped up to massive numbers like it was in World War II. A 1993 paper stated that it would take almost 4 years to surge production at Lima, currently the sole remaining plant, to 120 tanks a month, and then it would be 6 years to restart production at a close plant, which today might be the Detroit Arsenal. However, the US would completely run out of tanks long before then. It's also worth noting that your enemy, at least hopefully, would be losing equipment at a similar rate and would be unable to replace them quick enough. But keeping 25 to 50% in reserves means the US could assemble around 10 to 20 new BCTs instead of 63. So, not much. Another issue I think is worth taking a quick look at is how many new troops the US could train. Again, with the complexity of modern military hardware, training takes much longer to utilize and maintain them adequately. As mentioned, the US Army Reserve will be the first place to turn to. It currently consists of nearly 190,000 soldiers who train 1 weekend a month and then 2 weeks straight once a year. So they would still need additional training before they were combat ready. After them would be conscription. The US selective service system requires that all males between the ages of 18 and 25 have to be registered and potentially drafted in the event of a war. Right now, that's roughly 15 million potential soldiers. This is a slow process though. The selective service system also states that those drafted must appear within 193 days. Then Title 10 of the US Code states that no soldier will serve outside the US until they have completed at least 12 weeks of basic training. That means it could take up to 9 months before drafted could begin replacing units overseas. And even then, it would not be a large boost. Current estimates predict that the number of soldiers training per year could only be increased 37% over the current rates at existing sites. So there's a lot of issues limiting not just the US, but any country being able to fully mobilize in the event of World War III. Tanks, aircraft, ships all take much longer to construct, and training personnel is now more challenging as well. And then of course, this all ignores a nuclear war occurring during such a conflict. The odds of that are not very great, but no one wants to get nuked, so that's motivation for no one to use them. It's not going to help anyone win a war, as they would just lose as well in nuclear retaliation. The larger threat of nuclear war might come toward the end when a nuclear power is about to lose. They might then make the decision that if they're going to lose, everyone else should as well. Although, in the past, most nations have decided to surrender when they're facing imminent total annihilation. Japan in World War II, for example. So, it is possible that a World War III could be fought without nuclear weapons, although slim. Or it's possible a World War III could just turn into a bigger version of Ukraine. Lots of action initially, then turn pretty much into a stalemate, as each side runs low on modern weaponry and unable to replace losses quick enough. Warfare today makes it really difficult to break through enemy lines, and in some ways makes defense somewhat easier. So without enough tanks, aircraft, etc., each side might stall out. But hopefully we'll never have to find out. And finally, this video took a ton of research and notes, and here are just some of them, but also the 3D modeling showing literally thousands of vehicles. So please let me know if you like the 3D animations so I can decide whether they're worth the time to make. In fact, right now as I'm recording this, they're still rendering in the background. Thanks.